Good evening. This is a meeting of the Finance and Appropriations Committee for today, April 13th of 2022. I'm Eric Brown, and I will be leading the meeting. And let's start with pledge. We don't do that here.
We don't do that here, but if you'd like it, you're more than welcome
Why don't we
to.
go ahead?
Yes.
I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, tonight we're calling the meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Board President Adair. Well, she is present virtually, I believe. Board Member Brown.
Here.
Board Member Cole. Mr. Green.
Here.
Ms. Johnson. Mr. Jordan. And Mr. Miller.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Thank you, and we're going to work through our agenda. It's not a terribly full agenda. We've got approval of the minutes, then we'll have our quarterly financial updates with an update on ESSER, have our monthly financial report, 5-year forecasts, and then we can adjourn. Why don't we move first to the minutes? Minutes for March 9th. We have a motion for approval.
I'll move it.
Any questions or concerns? Roll call, please.
Board Member Brown.
Yes.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Board President Adair.
Yes.
Thank you. That motion carried.
Thank you. And now, Stan?
Thank you.
Sure.
Before we start with the next item, the update on ESSER, I'd like to introduce a new member to the table here this evening. Kristen Gregg, to the left of Terry, has joined the leadership team in my office as the Director of Budget and Finance, or Director of Finance and Budget. I don't know which way that reads, but in any case, she had been a budget analyst within that department, Terry's department, for some time. And how long had you been a budget analyst?
A little over a year.
A little over a year. And as you know, Terry moved up to the executive director position of budget and finance. And so we were real pleased to bring someone internally up to that position. Previously, she'd been with Westerville Schools in the Treasurer's Department over there. So we're real excited to have her join the team. Thought we would initiate her new role by inviting her to attend the entire Finance Committee meeting today. So here she is, and I welcome her to the team.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And you may now proceed with the
okay.
report.
We'll move right along. This evening, you have a quarterly financial update. Quarterly is somewhat of a misnomer because of scheduling and whatnot. We don't always hit it quarterly, but we do eventually bring these reports back around to you. At this point in time, we have an update from Catherine Mosier on our ESSER funds that the district has available to them. And so I'll turn the meeting over to Catherine, and looks like her PowerPoint slides are up and ready to go. So Catherine, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Ryan, if you could cue that slide, put that back up. Thank you. And I would just mention the slides are available on board docs. Members, I believe that you also have an executive summary to accompany the report. So I am going to spend a little bit of time this afternoon talking not just about the financial, but also some of the policy implications that are becoming increasingly clear as we move further into ESSER. So just a little context for the next couple of minutes. But as you see on the slide, the timeline for our expenditures has not changed. The dollar amount for ESSER 2 has increased just a slight amount, and we do now have access to ARP or ESSER 3 dollars. So as you can see, we're wrapping up ESSER 1 this summer. We'll be doing reporting in late summer, and then have access to ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 next school year. ESSER 3 will take us into September of 2024. Next slide. So I have started to talk in terms of the pandemic and our spending in terms of phases. ESSER 1, we really focused on health and safety, plexiglass, masks, sanitizer, Chromebooks was a major expenditure from ESSER 1. Really all of those items that were needed to first convert to remote instruction and then respond to the hybrid environment. ESSER 2 has been, for the most part, focused around those items that were needed to return to school. And so you see system-wide strategies there. And we also decided to fund our HVAC improvements for the last 16 schools that do not have air conditioning. That will be addressed this coming summer, and we're able to use ESSER 2 funds to do that work. ESSER 3 is focused on student supports. And even though the guideline says that we must use at least 20% of our ESSER 3 funds to address academic issues, we will far exceed that set aside guidance. But here, certainly the need for student support, whether it's academic or social emotional, you may recall that we have hired additional counselors. We're providing supplemental services in terms of our teacher hours and additional supports for all student groups. I have a gray line in the bottom of ESSER 3 under phase 3. I call it phase 4. It's gray because I think it really is the fuzzy area, because every time you ask me, do we have enough funds? Are we on track? I always respond to you, is the pandemic over? Can you tell me how long? Can you tell me what students and teachers are going to need? And so I keep it on this slide intentionally because I think it's very clear we should not expect to receive another influx of funds. Therefore, ESSER 3 is going to need to take us forward. And that gray area is really troublesome on the budget planning side because it needs to account for all of the unknowns. I feel like we certainly are on track and our strategies align to what we need, but should there be another variant spike, other issues that come along, we would need to go back and adapt our planning. Next slide, please. So what has become increasingly clear is that there is tremendous public interest and legislative interest into how districts are spending the ESSER dollars. What you see on the screen are the 4 major categories that we have been told we will be reporting our spending within these categories, with a few additional notes down at the bottom regarding personnel, technology, and contracted services. The difference between bullet 2 and 3, meeting student academic, social, emotional, and other needs, and then mental health supports, is that in bullet 3, the call out there is around services that are provided by a licensed medical professional. So while you see SEL or mental health supports sometimes used interchangeably, when it comes to how we report on our spending, we will be very specific about the difference. So again, in bullet 3, we will be reporting only on any expenditures that we have where we are paying for licensed medical professionals. I think what I would just alert you to here again is that there is tremendous interest in how districts are spending, and that we should expect significant reporting requirements. I'll talk about what we know so far, but I believe that additional reporting requirements will be coming. Next slide. So while these are not the only categories that we are allowed to spend in, these have certainly been identified as areas of interest, both from the federal government and the Ohio Department of Education. They are going to be very interested in what we are doing to support students in terms of summer programs, after school. You can see the list there. Special interest around technology purchases and wraparound services. So again, expect that as I come to you each quarter, I will be bringing information about how we are spending in the 4 areas that I just showed, and then special call out in these 7 areas. Again, this does not prohibit us from using funds for other identified needs, but these are the ones that seem to be of special interest in terms of reporting. On your executive summary, you will see our spending by ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 in each of the highlighted areas. Next slide. So this slide is intentionally dense in terms of text to drive home the point that when we are reporting out on our spending, we will be reporting not only in dollars spent, but we will also be reporting out on students served. And the federal government has identified the following student demographic groups that they are especially interested in, and we are already beginning to report this information to the Ohio Department of Education. So for example, when we talk about our summer programming, come the end of the summer when we are doing our report out, we will report on the total number of students served and then the students in a number of demographic groups in terms of their participation. I think this is especially important to name for this group because the data collection upfront and ongoing is going to be significant. The personnel hours and the need to be very intentional when we're planning our strategies so that we set up for data collection from the beginning is going to be critical. The Great City Schools recently did some calculations, and based on what we know about the guidance for what we will be reporting at the end, they're estimating that it's 2 million hours of data collection and reporting just across the large urban districts that are part of the Council of Great City Schools. So I name that one to let you know that we are aware and already planning for this, but also just to name that the data collection and reporting is going to be significant. It's going to be a cost in and of itself that requires personnel time to do that. And last slide, if we could move to that one. So, but call it threats. I think not threats in the negative, if that's possible, but really just to keep in front of you. These are the things that I think could most significantly adjust the planning that we're currently undertaking and monitoring. One, certainly if there are additional variants that come along. I know we've already seen the city of Philadelphia, for example, just this week, return to mandatory indoor masking. If that should occur in our area, would certainly cause some additional expenses. We would need to make sure that we are continuing to restock for adult and student masks, sanitizer, other items. The second one has to do with compensatory service. We're expecting some additional guidance around the compensatory services that we have begun and will continue to provide for students with IEPs. So I do want us to carefully watch that line. And then I talked about the data collection as well. Again, we have a process in place that we launched from the very beginning. Whenever we are accessing ESSER funds, you remember that we have an impact report that we require that is beyond what was requested initially, but we have an internal process for monitoring our impact. But then, as I also shared in the presentation this afternoon, you saw the additional categories where there will be a tremendous amount of additional reporting to disaggregate our spending, our strategies, and the impact in each of those 4 areas. So Ryan, you can close the slides, and I'm certainly open to any questions.
Anybody have any questions for Catherine or for Stan on the ESSER program? Just have one. These are all one-time funds, correct?
Yes, there's a limit. There's a sunset on these funds, yes.
Okay, and as we're choosing what to spend the funds on within the allowable categories, are we staying cognizant of the fact that they're one-time funds and that we don't want to spend them on things that we will either need to cut later or find a different funding source for later? I guess, how are we doing that, and is that accurate?
Are we cognizant of that? Yes, Catherine and I are extremely cognizant of that because we started this conversation with my little euphemism of don't create recurring expenses out of non-recurring income unless you really want to and plan for it. I had to add that little phrase because there are potentially some things in ESSER that we want to continue. And in my conversations with the superintendent, she has repeatedly said to me that they, Catherine, others, will be evaluating all the programmatic things that they're doing and deciding at some point, should we continue these? And if so, what would that alternative funding be? Catherine, is that a fair statement?
Perfect.
Great. And that's a good question for like the third item on our agenda, which is the 5-year forecast. And we have not included anything from ESSER in the forecast. That certainly is, Catherine referred to them as threats. I refer to them as risks, that as we go further in time, as I'll just use Catherine as the identity for deciding this. But as Catherine decides, yes, we want to continue these, we'll learn about rolling that into the forecast to see how that will affect general fund expenditures. But that's an ongoing consideration and something that we monitor, but they're not yet ready to commit to continuation or elimination of some of the things that they're putting into place.
I guess the other question I have is probably more for Eric than anybody else. There has been a lot of talk about the gap and how long it's going to take for people to catch up to where they would have been had it not been for the pandemic. And that there's a pretty good-sized gap there, and that it certainly affected minorities and others, more than anybody else. So my question is, to your knowledge, is Congress not only aware of that, but are they considering doing this kind of funding beyond 2024?
To the chairman, I certainly would probably be a very wealthy individual if I could determine what Congress is going to do next. I would say yes. I think that Congress is aware because a number of associations on the national and state level certainly have continued to make them aware of the need and the continued need. Whether or not Congress will appropriate said funds, I think is a giant question mark. I think a lot of that will have to, we're getting into what I'll call the silly season as we get closer to the elections. So I think that the chance of something major happening between now and the election day is probably slim. If I were to venture a guess, lame duck period may be even more difficult, and then depending upon how the elections turn out, who only knows what the next Congress may do. I do know that President Biden has suggested some increases in title funds through his budget. If I did that, boy, I don't know what I did. All will have to tell me. I know that there are some increases that have been suggested through title funds, but nothing of the magnitude that we saw, certainly through ARP. So,
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Fair. Anybody else have questions? If not, Dan, you may
Okay.
proceed.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. The next item on the agenda is the financial report for March. And I'll wait for that PowerPoint to come up. There it is. For the month, revenues in March were approximately $8 million below plan on $114 million received. And that variance is primarily due to variances in property taxes and state aid. Expenditures were about $3.5 million over plan on $67 million expended for the month. And again, the large categories there were personnel and purchase services. Fiscal year to date, total revenue is about 3% above plan, and total expenditures about 1.2% above plan. And the cash balance, therefore, which stood at $565 million at the end of the month, is about $6.5 million over plan. Getting into some of the revenue detail, in March, first half property tax settlement was received. And for this settlement period, we came in about $10 million above plan. In the previous settlement period, which was back in August, September timeframe, the first half of this fiscal year, we were about $2.1 million above plan. So all in all, that drove us to about $12 million over plan at this point in property taxes. So that's the variance is in the direction we like it to be, and it's of the magnitude that is acceptable. State aid, again, this month is under plan by about $3.4 million. It was $3.7 million under plan last month. I've talked about those variances, and I expect now that the formula's in place and the state's reporting out on that, and we're getting a good feel for how that calculation works, we expect to remain under plan and probably into the year around $12 million under plan as we expected last month. This is going to be a tough target to understand. Part of that under plan is about $3.9 million on the new formula and lower enrollment than what LSC probably assumed, and that was the estimate I was using. There are about $1 million of adjustments from last year that they carried forward. This has a tendency to happen. They always have these final number two payments. There's more than one final number two kind of a thing payment that comes through. But we're also involved in a dispute over a transportation penalty that was embedded in House Bill 110. There is pending litigation, so I can't necessarily go into it, but know that we're pushing back on this penalty, pushing back hard enough to have stopped that deduction temporarily. So I have backed it out, but it's likely to come back in some fashion, so that's a variable and a risk that we have. The last number I saw was about $5.9 million annually. I think it's probably doubled by now, but that's not being reflected here yet. So while I say we're $12 million projected under plan, it could be maybe $6 million under, or it could be $20 million under. I just don't know where we might be at this point because of the pending litigation. When we look at other revenues, the restricted federal grant is the interest reimbursement on the qualified school construction bonds. That reimbursement program just got messed up, I think, during COVID and the timing, and we're 2 payments behind probably. We're tracking it, but your guess is as good as mine. We expect usually about $500,000 during the year. So it's not a big item, but it's just one of those nuisances that we just don't know when it's going to occur. Property tax allocation, we're right on target. We should get that next month, and I believe that'll remain pretty much on target. And in other revenues, that's driven by pilot payments, which are about 5.7 above plan at this point. No change in other financing sources, which is your advances and transfers. Keep the concept of pilots ever ready in your mind. Every month I've mentioned that, yeah, we're ahead on pilots. And, pilots are those, when we go to the Board of Revision and file a complaint or file a counter complaint on property tax, property valuations, we are usually requesting increases. The property owner is usually requesting a decrease. It would be odd to do something different because that would not be in our particular interest. But at times, once a decision at BR is reached, the property tax owner and us will meet and reach a settlement outside of going on to the Board of Tax Appeals. And there's a laundry list of reasons why that's beneficial for both parties. So we reach an agreement, and that lasts for several years until the next update. And those are the ones that I estimate low, and usually we exceed that. I'll talk to you a little bit later about how those are now going to be eliminated down the road. So that'll be in the 5-year forecast. I think that was, yes, I missed advancing the slide, my bad. Now we go on to expenditures. Total expenditures for the month, $3.5 million over plan. That took the year-to-date or fiscal year-to-date variance over plan by about $6.5 million or 1%. Personnel was $1.1 million over plan on $52 million expended. And we're moving, actually, we were further under plan last month, so we're moving closer to plan. And we're now at $6 million under plan or a 1.2% variance. Purchase services leads the way in the other expenditures. They were $1.3 million over plan for the month, but they're still running under plan on the year. This is a look at the other non-personnel and other line items. As I said, non-personnel, all these expenditures added together were 2.3 million over plan for the month, and that overall variance then went to 12.5 million above plan. Fiscal year-to-date purchase services, as you can see, is under plan by about 2.2 million. Supplies and materials about 4.6 million above plan. Capital outlay 2.7 million above plan. Over in the other uses category, you can see that we're about 8 million above plan. That's where we were last month, but as you recall, we executed that $4.1 million transfer to a PI fund, Permanent Improvement Fund, as the some of the initial funding for a capital improvements budget, which is the subject of our, hopefully, what we recommended to the board as a PI levy, the 4.7 mil PI levy. So that's over on the far right-hand side, and that overplan variance will continue likely to the end of the year. And that is my summary for the month of March. I can answer any questions you might have before we move on into the forecast.
Go ahead.
It's a pending lawsuit, so when is that, when do you think that's going to be resolved? How long?
It'll be a while. I don't know, Attorney Brown, how long do lawsuits take? I can say this, that I don't know what it is in legal parlance, but they've been asking for documents, and then we're going to have a hearing, and that's not until later in April. I think we're very much in the infancy of this whole process. I think it's measured in months. That's why I don't know if this will be resolved prior to fiscal year end or not. But I'm sure that any penalties that still exist for this year, they don't take them out this year. They're going to take them out next year.
I would not anticipate anything happening or being completed this fiscal year. That's, if I recall, I think that the hearing that was going to be at the end of April was bumped to the end of May.
I think you're absolutely correct. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And that particular hearing is dealing with status as we go forward in the litigation. It means, are we, is the penalties to be imposed or not to be imposed during the litigation? Right now, we've got it on hold, but I don't know if there's agreement yet to extend that beyond the end of May. But case, when it's filed, is automatically put into a one-year trial to occur in a year. I don't know how big and complex this is going to get and whether other school districts are going to become involved. Certainly they're interested, and that would slow things down considerably. But the court here in Franklin County tends to try to move things quickly. It's known for that. So we'll just have to see.
So we put that kind of, in the parking lot over here, and here are the numbers. And by the way, here's the potential for some variance.
And I should say I was speaking as a layperson school board member based on what I have read and know. I am in no way the school board's lawyer. Moving on, any other questions? All right, back to you, Mr. Behort.
All right, thank you. Next item is our May update to the 5-year forecast. There we go. As I said, this is what I refer to as the update. It's our May forecast. The initial forecast is in November, and that's when we bump 1 year off and bring a new year in to that 3 years of actual and 5 years of projected. Here we're just doing an update based upon we've got 8-9 months worth of actual that we can roll in, and we've got a little bit better picture of what tomorrow might hold in many of these revenue and expenditure items. So we do this update. On the cover page, I'll just note that this is a team effort. My list of folks who contribute to this is growing, so I get help from all of those. Terry and Tito Reynolds, who is in financial operations, and Eric over here, and you've all met Jenny before. We have a new member that has spent, it's been an interesting time for a fellow that came to us not from schools, but has jumped right in and is in a position that is near and dear to my heart. It's entitled Data Verification Analyst, but it's basically someone that I can yell things at and they go find out an answer to it for me because I don't know what the background is. So he seems to enjoy that job. It's great, but he's great in digging into those details, and he helped out a lot when we looked at the state funding formula. He jumped right in on that. And so when we talked about what you'll see here, some declines in state funding, he was very instrumental in helping us conceptualize how do we factor in declining enrollment in this rather complicated formula. So it's been valuable input. And I did leave one person's name off the list, although I invited her to the meeting. She did participate in the meeting because I talked to Terry and Kristen about the non-personnel budget side that comes over, and then they keep track of the staffing plan that the superintendent side of the house prepares, and so we work. They bring that data over to me, and then we munch it and crunch it and put it in. So I'll have to go back and we'll add a name. So my apologies for not putting you on the cover page. So this is the May 5-year forecast. You'll hear this evening. I will take it to the board on May 3rd for a presentation, and then on May 17th it will be adopted by the board and then filed with the appropriate authorities. As always, I begin with putting this in context. That forecasting is always very difficult, especially if it's about the future. I thought that was a funny one. And then I always have to give credit to Board Member Brown for this quote. And what I take away from here is kind of in the last part of this, that it's intended, the forecasting is intended to tell you what you need to know to take meaningful action in the present. And what is that meaningful action for this committee and or the board's level of purview? And to me, the meaningful action is, do you see anything in the forecast that would cause us to decide that we need to increase revenue or decrease expenditures? That's really the macro level that this forecast is intended to highlight and point out to you and say, boy, based on what we see, we need to respond to this in some fashion. It's not to drill down into each individual line item necessarily, although I will walk you somewhat down into that depth of this document. But it's really to say, are we kind of on target? Are we on plan? We can continue on without having to consider those two things. And those two things are an operating levy to increase revenue, or an expenditure reduction, which means, boy, the whole house has to get together and start looking at a plan to reduce expenditures and kind of unwind some things. So that's what we're looking at here. There is a legal requirement to do this in November and have that filed, and then also do an update here by May 31, or any other time when a significant event would cause a change in the forecast. I just remind you that back in 2016, we did have a significant event. We passed an operating levy, and so I refiled the forecast in December. So that's an example of when that comes into play. And lastly, just keep in mind, this is just our snapshot of where we are. It's based upon what we know, and then I'll identify some variables of things we don't know that will have an impact on the forecast ultimately. So let's get into the May forecast. So overall, for total revenues and expenditures, this is what they look like. The first three sets of bars are the actuals for 19, 20, and 21. And then the projection begins in 22 and runs out to fiscal year 26. There's a couple of takeaways from this chart. The first being, note that between 19 and 20, we had a drop in both revenues and expenditures. I call that the COVID effect. We had a reduction in state revenue because when the state budget got a little short on their revenue, they did a reduction to all school districts. Ultimately, we got some of that back the next fiscal year. And we were doing things differently. We weren't doing some of the stuff like transportation and didn't incur those both personnel and supply and material costs. So there was a reduction there, kind of a very unique period of time because it's rare for revenue and expenditures to drop from one year to the next. The next takeaway is this big drop from 21 to 22. That's totally related to the implementation of the new funding formula and the fact that students are now funded where they are educated. So they no longer come to us as revenue and then go out as an expenditure in terms of voucher and charter school deductions. So that was a $200 million drop there. And lastly, you'll see between fiscal 24 and fiscal 25, there's another anticipated drop in revenue, albeit fairly small, but that is directly due to, and I mentioned this earlier, pilots and House Bill 126 and its enactment. It's not law yet. It's pending signature of the governor. And if anybody's listening, I would love to have the governor veto this bill. But this impairs our ability to participate in the Board of Revision process, prevents us from appealing to the Board of Tax Appeals, and eliminates these outside of that process agreements between a Board of Education and a taxpayer to make these payments in lieu of taxes to settle on an agreed-to value. Takes those away. So I factor out about $15 million in those outer years of pilots as they expire or run out. The current pilots will stay in effect if this becomes law, but they will eventually run out and expire. Revenue growth in general is about 1.25% on an annual basis from fiscal 22 to 26. Expenditure growth right now is predicted at or projected at 3.6% annually. So you don't have to be an MIT professor to know that that's not a sustainable position to be in. Moving further down into the forecast to lines 6, 7, and 6 and 7, this is simply to show revenues over or under expenditures. That's the green bar. If the green bar is positive, we're building a cash balance. If the green bar is negative, we're depleting the cash balance. The blue bars are our cash balance. As you see, it climbs pretty much through fiscal 22. Then in fiscal 23, it begins to decline as our expenditures do exceed our estimated revenues, our projected revenues. The other noteworthy thing is that in fiscal 26, we do not meet our 30-day cash reserve as is our target. It will be going negative. But we do have cash, we just don't meet our 60 days cash.
Your quick reference to 30 days was just a miss.
Did I say 30 days?
The first time.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. It's 60 days.
Yeah.
We used to look at 30. GFOA came out and said best practice is 60, and I've been trying to get everybody to think 60, and now I'm not doing it. But it's all a 60-day reserved cash balance. Sorry. This graph ties together two lines on the forecast: property tax and what we call the property tax allocation. The property tax allocation is the 10 and 2.5% rollback that the state does for taxpayers. So they reduce your tax bill, and then it flows through the state and comes back to us. Levies passed after 2013 are not subject to that tax credit any longer, so our 2016 levy is not subject to this. Just keep that in mind. It increases the tax burden on local property taxpayers. They put that in place, but just wanted to let you know that the 16 levy is not impacted by this. But I put them together because essentially this is all generated from the levying of property taxes. The combined growth rate here is about 2.27% annually, and the historical rate was 2.8. That's in keeping with our conservative nature of forecasting our revenue and expenditures. This is state aid. The two pieces of state aid are unrestricted and restricted aid. And restricted aid comes to us in the form of student wellness and success funds, DPIA, disadvantaged pupil impact aid, used to be called economic disadvantaged aid, English learners, gifted, and career tech education. So we get lines specifically for those, and they're intended to be restricted for use on those programs or various allowable uses under student wellness and success. So that drops about $200 million in FY22, again, due to the new formula and the elimination of the deductions. Note too, what's interesting is that that drop in revenue came in the unrestricted funds category. So if we look at it on a percent to total basis, you'll see it here that it's pretty clear that the restricted funds now represent a greater proportion, not horribly significant, but a greater portion than in past when that, and here's the interesting thing, in those prior years before the new formula, the distinction for us, because we were on the cap, and they did what I always call some funky accounting, that the differentiation between the two lines, 1035 and 1040, was an accounting convention, not what it is now, which is truly a representation of what they're giving us as it's restricted and unrestricted. So like you're going to see in some of the expenditure categories, we're getting back to where it really looks what it should look like, quite frankly, in terms of the percentage revenue or some of the percentages we have on what we expend. But this just shows that relationship now that we're in the new funding formula. In all other revenues, the green bar here, that's tuition, investment income, pilots, including income tax sharing from the city, which is part of CRAs and tax abatements, win-win payments, which are going to be phased out here shortly, and Medicaid reimbursement, which is a fairly sizable, $2-3 million item each year. Notice in the out years, 25 and 26, the drop. That's the $15 million that I pulled out for pilots when I expect them to run out. Total other financing sources are all just transfers and advances in. They're really that's just nothing special going on there, I guess is what I can say. Okay. This is showing you all revenue sources and their contribution to overall revenue. The takeaway here is look at state aid, the yellow portion of the bar. It's much more significant in the first 3 years, which are actuals, and now it's diminished because of the new funding formula. And we can take a look here and see how our funding sources align with one another. So we're about 70% property tax, 20% state aid, 4% in the property tax allocation. So if you want to say what's generated from real estate taxes, it really could be close to 74, 75%. 4% other and 1% other financing sources, those transfers in and advances in. So that's the breakdown of our revenue in the forecast. Moving over to the expenditure side, we begin with personnel, broken out salary and wages and employee benefits. I typically report to you them collapsed together as a total personnel. But here's a breakout of them. Overall, they're forecasted to increase at about 3.6% on an annual basis versus a historical rate of about 1.25%. And I'm going to say, note the impact of fiscal 20 on this. That we've been in such an anomaly in the last couple of years relative to these types of costs. It's not indicative of a normal operation and where we're going in the future. So this includes the new staffing plan overlaying that, collective bargaining agreements through 22 this fiscal year. We'll be engaged in collective bargaining. Well, we are and will continue to be. So that's a variable that we're not able to fully forecast. But that's how personnel looks.
What's the period that a collective bargaining agreement, what's the target length of time that?
Usually about 3 years.
Is it a 3-year one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on to some non-personnel items. You'll see the dramatic drop in purchase services. This is where the voucher deduction and charter deduction occurred. So they dropped from $266 million in 21 down to an estimated projected number of $66 million in '22. This is all based upon those budgets that Terry and Kristen worked with staff members to put together. We roll that into the forecast. I do some modification to those numbers based upon historical spend patterns. You have a budget of X, but you only spend Y. Historically, what is it? If I put the budget in here, it would be larger. I want this to be a little bit more of a cash flow document if I can. See how close we can get to actual cash expenditures. You're going to see here a little bit later that we're going to revisit some of these numbers. But for now, this is the best we know. So those are the three big non-personnel items. We'll point out real quick, note that the scale on the left-hand side has changed from, hundreds of millions down to 10 million. So these are much smaller items, but the debt-related is, the bus purchase bonds and Q-Scoobies. We have to report some debt in the general fund that really doesn't exist there, but it's reported on the 5-year forecast because it is general fund debt-related. But anyway, it runs about $4 million a year until it's paid off in 25 and 26, so that drops off. And then other objects, which is primarily our auditor and treasurer fees, and they're varying a couple $100,000 in the projection. So not horribly material to the overall forecast, but I do, wanted to share the changes that occur year to year in the current forecast. The last two lines, I believe, line 501 for operating transfers out and 502 advances out. The transfers, as you can see here, in 19 at $34 million, that included $30 million for the Dominion North Brookhaven program realignment. In 21, as you hopefully recall, we transferred $80 million to a permanent improvement fund for the Student Transportation Fleet Replacement Program, in other words, to buy buses, in short. And then in 21, as I mentioned earlier in the financial report, we made a $4.1 million transfer, some startup capital for the capital budget. And then there's a budget request, and we're including it in the forecast of $36.6 million to, again, initially fund that capital budget in anticipation of the PI levy that hopefully will be on the ballot this fall. That PI levy will begin to be collected in January of '23. Get about a half year's worth of collection, which should be around $25 million, $24, $25 million half-year collection. So coupled with this 33, we should be to a full year collection of that levy. That's kind of what the target is. So that's what's there. After that, it drops back in 24, 25, and 26 to just the debt service, the athletic seed money that we give them, and then we've included the transfer for the radio station over time based upon their recent update to that programming. Then the advances out, that's really no change from any other forecast. That's there to, when we have to advance funds for cash flow purposes, to other funds. So they go to the other funds and then come back when cash flow permits. Looking at the composition overall of expenditures, again, note that the yellow portion changes dramatically. That's purchase services due to no vouchers and no charters coming out. I simply show you that on a percentage basis here, just to give you a look at that. Now, what's interesting is now personnel is more in the 80% range, which is more typical of most school districts. So now our charts like this, our finances, look more like a typical school district. Before this, when charter and vouchers were coming in at the top and going out at the bottom, it distorted our picture and made it look like we only had 66% in personnel. We've really always had 80 to 85% in personnel. It's just the way they funded those charters and vouchers that messed up that relationship comparison. And I remember I used to pull those out and give you a different chart saying if this wasn't here, we'd look like this. Well, now we look like this, and this is a better reflection on what our actual expenditure makeup is. So one of the things I also like to do is make comparisons of what's different today than November. I said this was an update. So really what is comprised in the update, and where are these changes? So the first thing we want to look at is property taxes. You can see the green bar here is what we had forecasted in November, and then the blue bar is what we're forecasting today. And this one's pretty simple. Told you earlier we had about a $12 million above plan variance in property tax revenues. I factor that in. I let that grow a bit over years, and you can see that it adds just a sliver to each one of those years. And some people say, well, geez, Stan, that's 12 million, then 16 million, then 17 million. That's, to me, kind of more than a silver. Well, relative to everything else, this is just a minor adjustment in our property taxes. So we've got that in there. It's all based upon our expectations for the current year. Property tax allowance, again, really based in part on actuals, because we're going to be just a hair under plan on that this year. But the extra 12 million in property taxes will generate a little bit more in the tax credit. So I factored that in. You can see it's barely $1 million and a half each year that rolls forward. So these are all just tweaks, if you will, to those lines in the forecast. This is the breakdown for state aid, both unrestricted and restricted. The first two bars, the green and the blue, are the unrestricted. They go together. And the second two bars, the yellow and the darker green, go together. That's the restricted. As you can see, as the unrestricted dropped, the restricted went up a bit, kind of offsetting one another. And you can get a better look at it here when I graph out just those changes. So you can see that, for instance, in 22, the unrestricted dropped about 23 million. The restricted went up about 18 million. So that it tends to offset it. Overall, though, when we look at the state aid, there we go. Overall, when we look at state aid, you can see 5 million change in 22, 2 million in 23, 7, 10, 14. Not much change in our forecast for state aid, but there are a couple of things to point out. Note that back in November, for 24, 25, and 26, we projected state aid flat at the 23 level, 181. We made no assumption about the legislature doing more or doing less in funding public schools. Now that we're looking at the formula, now that we have a enrollment forecast out of the FMP process, and some folks place different confidence on that enrollment forecast, but when we look, and Dr. Brown has looked at our enrollment over the years, there's been a decline. It's not flat, ever so slight. So we factored in a 1 to 2% decline in enrollment in these numbers. So you can see here that while 23 does go up, it's based upon the LSC estimate, but reduced a bit to reflect the drop in enrollment. So you can see back in 22 we thought 169, we're getting 164. Some of that's due to enrollment. 181 versus 170. I know that it doesn't seem like a lot, but we are reflecting the reality that that the enrollment number isn't quite what that was originally estimated when that budget bill was being considered. And then we let it decline just a bit each year to be more reflective of what we expect reality to be based upon those enrollment projections. So that's just our best picture there. This is other revenues, kind of all the miscellaneous categories, other revenues. Are pretty flat in the November forecast. We've done some increases based upon those coming in above plan this year, so you can see they climb until you get to 25 and 26, and you see that's a $12 million reduction. Again, 15 million of pilots coming out, offset a little bit by increases in other revenue lines. So the net, it's down about 12 million in those years. So that's what that picture is all about. Moving on to other financing sources. Not much change here. 22 just reflects actual, and then the balance of those years has remained unchanged. So nothing noteworthy on that line. We then get to the expenditure side to make those comparisons back to from November to May. Minimal changes in personnel relative to what we knew back in November. We've overlaid the new spending plan. We did have a spending plan in there, but we've updated those numbers with the current ones. Not a big difference here in terms of our planning. As you can see, very minimal slices down there, 4 or 5 million, 3 million or so. So personnel line item has remained relatively unchanged from our November forecast. But now we get into non-personnel, and the next three lines are the ones that we're going to take a revisit over the next few months and look at the comparison between what everyone submitted last March, a year ago, and what they submitted this March, because these changes seem to be a little bit larger, and we just want to make sure that that's an accurate representation of what we're actually going to be doing. So even with all that I do with making some changes to the budget and reducing those based upon historical spend patterns, you can see here that there has been a fairly substantial increase. This is purchase services since last November. You'll see a very similar one for supplies and materials. You can see some changes there. And then last but certainly not least, we have capital outlay. You see some changes there. Now, admittedly, this is a fairly small line item, nothing here above $12 million. We believe some of what might be embedded here might be covered by a PI capital budget, but as oftentimes is, you want to budget for it in the general fund, and if another source of revenue comes up, we'll shift those expenditures. Not a big line item, $7 million in the plan isn't going to go to zero necessarily, but if we could move $3 or $4 million out to the PI side and pay for it out of that capital budget, then so be it, and we'll get it out of the general fund. But I just want to let you know that those are three big lines that we'll take a harder look at here in the coming months. Here's your other objects, nothing new here. Those changes are very, very minimal from November. We get into the operating transfers out. Again, you can see the impact of the $4.1 million and the $36.6 million to fund that capital budget. And then advances out, there's literally no change. I think that's a $1 million change for 22, but I assume just a flat $11 million being available for those advances out. So in total, this is how expenditures look. If you remember, pretty small changes from the revenue side in the single-digit millions of dollars. But on the expenditure side, 15, 70, 42, the expenditure side that's really driving this change. So taking a look at that increase and decrease for the revenue over and under expenditures, you can see that we, for instance, in 22 expected to build the cash balance by 17. We expect now to build it by 14. In 23, expected to build the cash balance by 11. Now we expect to deplete it by 40. So you can see that the growth here in expenditures exceeding revenues has changed substantially from November. That leads to this picture. Here's your cash balance picture. Again, green bars are back in November, blue bars are in 22. You can see if you go all the way out, just run out to 26 and see the overall impact. We had projected 283 in a cash balance. Now it's projecting, I think that's 111 or so, and that's a $171 million decrease in that cash balance. I'm going to get into the drivers of that. And then remember my discussion about the three non-personnel categories and whether or not that 171, I don't want to say we shouldn't be concerned about it, but I have an explanation of where that will perhaps solve itself organically. We'll take a look at that. Same picture for our 60-day cash reserved balance. The interesting thing here is this change out in '26 is 178 million down, about 7 million more, because the expenditures have gone up, so 60 days costs you more. That's all this is showing you. Same picture, but the reserved cash balance gets a little bit shorter. So I want to take a look at those changes and their impact on the cash balance. So what I've done is, I was showing the changes as positive, so I've inverted them where necessary. So the revenue changes, you can see, it built the cash balance, 12 million, 19, 15, 2 out in the last year. They were positive impacts on cash balance. But look at the total expenditure change. That's what's driving that decline in cash balance. I then wanted to take a closer look at that expenditure change and what are the factors contributing to that change. I have 3 major categories. Personnel, because we're always concerned about personnel because it's 85% of what we spend. So what did that contribute to the decline in cash balance from November to May? What did the non-personnel categories I've talked to you about contribute? And then transfer outs. Those are one-time items. They tend to be big-ticket items, so I wanted to point those out. So you can see, look at personnel. Pretty small slice of this change graph. Non-personnel, pretty consistent, and the largest contributor, typically, in those years to the decline in cash balance. And 22 and 23 are anomalies because of that transfer out for the capital budget. So I just want to give you that picture where they're coming from, because I think as we look at non-personnel, that's one where we're probably more likely to come in under that, have an improvement there, than to exceed that. But we'll look at that and come back to the committee as time goes by. Keep in mind, too, that we use this forecast as the basis, at least for the first 3 or 4 months of next fiscal year. It's the basis for our spending plan, which we do the monthly reports and compare variances. So each month that we talk about variances, it's really, this is what we see relative to the most recent forecast. So it's likely if we use those non-personnel numbers for our spending plan next year, we'll watch it, and if we're coming in under, then we'll know. That'll be an indication to us that, oh yeah, what we thought was probably true. Those numbers were a bit high. They're really not going to spend at that level. And then that will lead to a change in November when we have a new November forecast, and just on and on. The more we know, the more we build in, and we move forward. So those are all the lines that I want to discuss with you this afternoon. Let me close with some risks to this forecast. First of all, in the area of property tax, there are various pieces of legislation that have one that I mentioned, House Bill 126 that is passed and is pending signature by the governor that impedes our ability to participate in that Board of Revision process. And more importantly, as I like to tell people, it poses a risk to our ability to protect our tax base, What we do at the Board of Revision and what our goal is to ensure that property is fairly valued as the Constitution requires, and that everyone on the commercial side pays their appropriate fair share of taxes. That's what our goal is. This legislation impedes our ability to do that. And I'll get off my soapbox because I went to the OASBA annual conference and I was on my soapbox numerous times. Even in sessions that didn't apply to this, I would say work that in somehow. That's House Bill 126. There's also House Bill 123 that seeks to change the limits on abatements before they have to come to us for approval. Currently, the city could grant an abatement, or the county, I believe, can grant an abatement of 50% for 15 years or 75% for 10. If they change either one of those variables and increases them, they have to come to us and ask for our permission. Quite often they come to us and say, well, we'd like 100 for 15. And so we have those discussions. This bill seeks to set the limit at 75 for 15 and take us off the table. And so we won't be able to participate in that. It also seeks to raise the threshold where income tax sharing occurs. Abatements and these development projects typically are designed to be job growth items, initiatives. So after you hit $1 million in new payroll taxes, $1 million in new payroll, we share in that income tax stream. They're going to change that limit. It started at $3 million. It got amended down to 2 million. But in any case, that's just one more chink in the armor, if you will, one more step where we're not going to participate to be able to protect our tax base and our tax revenue, and to be remunerated for the deferral of property taxes and abatement. That's what the income tax sharing is intended to do, to defray some of that deferral of property tax. All of this is not in our favor. That's a risk. On the state aid side, this forecast covers 2 more state budgets, and the Fair School Funding Formula is not ensconced in law yet, and the phased-in funding approach has not been approved. So that's a risk. On the expenditure side, we mentioned collective bargaining agreements. Those will need to be renewed during this forecast. Undoubtedly, the results of that will impact the forecast. Inflation, need I say more? And 2, if you've looked at a yield curve lately, it's indicating that there's likely a chance for a recession. Yield curves don't stay inverted forever. So those are some of the things on the horizon that have the potential to impact the forecast, but this is the best we know now, and this is what I'll present to the board. And as I said, this committee meets to talk about things that happen in the meantime and where we stand relative to this forecast. What are those changes, and is there a call to action? So we will be talking at the next board meeting. Finance committee meeting. I'm going to take this forecast, and I have kind of an interactive piece of a spreadsheet where we can plug in the dates of a new operating levy and millage, watch what that does to the forecast. I take it out to fiscal 31 because I want to get out beyond 1 or 2 election cycles. We'll take a look at that and see how that plays out. I won't give you a spoiler alert. I live and breathe these numbers, so I have a pretty good idea of where we'll land, but we'll get to that in the first meeting in May. So that is a very long-winded discussion of the 5-year forecast, but it's an important document and something we use for planning and bouncing things off virtually daily. So thank you, and I'll entertain any questions you might have.
Thank you for the hard work that goes into this, and to your whole staff for helping put this together. Are there any questions? The 5-year forecast, or as we're reaching the last item on the agenda, about anything? There is one that I'd like to ask, a couple others that I want to talk with you about outside this meeting. But on the restricted versus unrestricted revenue that comes from the state, how does the amount of restricted revenue that we get for those special purposes compare to our needs, compare to what we're actually spending? Are we adding unrestricted dollars to those to be able to make those programs work? Or do we have more restricted funds than we necessarily need for those that we have to figure out a creative way to put to use?
We never receive more than we need in any category. How about that? But yes, there is a correlation comparison and a requirement that we make that comparison. Don't know those off the top of my head, other than knowing that we spend more than we receive. It was interesting. I had mentioned that I was just at the OASBO conference, and Matthew, that's on the list here that says my data, he came back and he said that exact same thing to me this morning, and he said, I just checked gifted, we're fine, and I'm going to check the other ones. So we do look at that, but we do spend more than what
Which means that we need to shift a little bit of general fund money.
Right. You know, I'm not so sure, maybe Eric can speak to it. I'm not real sure the intent of identifying those funds as restricted. Sometimes I think it sounds good. Maybe there are folks that don't spend. They want to make sure that that's the minimum that you spend. Maybe that's it. And it's probably more prescriptive than many of the lines in the current funding formula, because they aren't prescriptive. You know, they'll give you an allowance for so many teachers for this and so many guidance counselors for that. It's not prescriptive. You could do more or less. They're not going to come back and hunch on that. This one, though, we do have to identify expenditures that match up with that line. And Matt came back and he says, I have a list of function codes. It ties to this. I'll run those expenditure reports and make sure that we're aligned. I don't know, Eric, is there any other thing we can say about that?
No, my understanding is that the reason that they've, in this particular budget, especially put additional funds in those restricted lines is that those particular categorical expenditures, they wanted to make sure that those students were identified as having need for additional services, that those resources were going towards those students.
Okay. Thank you. Anything more from anybody? In that case, without objection, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.